Ever wanted to play in an established world as opposed to a generic world, but had some sort of concerns about that? Don't worry, I'm here to help. What's up, Internet? Jay here with Nerd Rage Against the Machine. Today I'm going to try something a little different. I'm going to call this an RPG boot camp. I have a few different ideas in this kind of situation, and if you like it, let me know and I'll do more. If you don't like it, also let me know so I do less. Before I get started, though, I do want to let you know I'm trying a different mic out, and I also have my 3D printer running, so you may hear some anomalies and some oddness. If that's the case, let me know so I can fix things as we go along. Anyway, today's video is really about role-playing in an established world versus one that's kind of a DIY world. And this has been something that I've talked about a lot with other gamers, the benefits, drawbacks, etc. of running in a world that was pre-established by an author, etc. versus, building your own. And let me start with actually, I think, the biggest myth in my opinion, which is that somehow, playing in an established universe is somehow less creative, less imaginative than starting everything cut from whole cloth. And honestly, that argument holds zero weight on every level. First off, let's start with the level of game design. Are you genuinely going to tell me that somebody like Mark Miller is somehow more creative than Gene Roddenberry or George Lucas? No, they just work in different mediums. I'm sorry, that's just not the case, guys. Now, from a design standpoint, one of the things that you see almost immediately in an RPG that was created based on a world versus one that's not is that need to fill the role of that genre. For example, where when they created the spell system for D&D, they could do whatever they wanted with it. And later fantasy novelists who made games based in D&D would just have to deal with, spell memorization, how many times per day you can cast a spell, and every other rule that Gygax and company set up in advance. In reverse, when, say, West End Games made the Star Wars RPG, they had to figure out ways to make the Force work, and specifically to make it work within the confines of the mechanics they were using. How does, lightsaber combat work? These are all things that they had to design to emulate Star Wars, as opposed to, well, we can basically come up with our own space magic system and call it a day. If it doesn't make a lot of sense, who cares? So there's the other side of that is, from a design standpoint, yes, they have to emulate, when you're designing a game based on Aliens, Call of Cthulhu, Star Trek, Star Wars, Marvel Comics, you have to keep that world in mind. And actually, speaking of comics, that's the other one. Again, from the player's perspective, the GM's perspective. First off, I hate to break it to you guys, but most of these games that are non-system specific have their own worlds. Greyhawk has as many rules as does Forgotten Realms, as, say, Middle-earth or Westeros. It's just true. And a lot of these RPGs, those worlds are literally just established worlds with the serial numbers filed off. As a perfect example, anyone who's ever played Champions has had to deal with the likes of the evil Dr. Destroyer or Mechanon. Are you seriously going to tell me that's any different from fighting Dr. Doom or Ultron? Really? No, they're not. They're the same basic idea. It's just Hero Games didn't have the Marvel license, so they built villains that were more or less this, that, or the other. And most of the villains in Champions feel that way. It's like, this one's kind of meant to be Joker. And there are some original characters, don't get me wrong. But, when you had that itch to fight something like Doctor Doom, they made Dr. Destroyer. Whereas, again, in a game like Marvel, I could simply say, yep, this is Doctor Doom, Latvian King coming to get you. Now, the third part, of course, is from the player's perspective or the GM's perspective. It's more creative to build that world whole cloth versus to build it from the ground up, or to adapt Star Wars. I disagree with this as well, mostly because, as I stated earlier, these games do have their own worlds, even if you don't use them, even if you ignore them, and you could do the same thing with these. There are ways you can divorce yourself far enough from it, but keep the same flavor. On top of that, it really is more about telling a story, and keeping the confines of that established universe is not as hard as you might think. Most of these worlds, Star Trek, for example, is a pretty expansive world. You go from everything from the wagon train to the stars that was classic to the Dominion War. You could easily set something in the 4 Years' War, even doing like an action adventure, Expendables kind of thing. And of course, you've got Lower Decks, Star Trek Prodigy. That series really runs the gamut, as does Star Wars. Alien might be a little darker, but then again, that going in, and you're going to build a game around it. You could, though, run a successful Aliens campaign without xenomorphs. It could be all about corporate brinksmanship, or the Space Marines, or other things. Same with Call of Cthulhu. It would be, it wouldn't be that hard to, because really Call of Cthulhu is set in a modern, or in a 1920s or modern day Earth, and you could remove the Lovecraftian creatures and go with traditional creatures, and it would still work. It's a theme and it's a vibe you're going for more than anything. And of course, same with any superhero game. Really, what you're getting out of it is those basic things. So to me, yeah, there's nothing more creative about running a game set in whole cloth. Right now, I'm currently in a RuneQuest campaign. I'm building the world from scratch, which means I'm basically building it as I go. And that's all right. It works. It's a fun way of doing things. But I don't think that there's anything less creative about learning to work within a framework. And tons of writers do that in real life. If you're told to write, if you're a writer for DC, you have to, again, adhere to their style. You have to adhere to their specifics. A lot of times you'll hear, especially with TV shows, they have what's called a writer's Bible, which is the things you can and can't do. If you're working on a sitcom like Big Bang Theory, you can't, make Sheldon out to be totally suave, not without some weird explanation that would probably, get cut off by the end of that episode so we can go back to the status quo. So in that end, no, I don't think there's anything less creative about running a game based in an established world. So what are the real pitfalls, though, of running in a world that is, again, established by a famous author, as opposed to one that is maybe established by the game designer? The big one, I think, is the fact, first off, the big benefit, I want to throw this out, is the fact that you have material and media that most people are probably familiar with. If I say, for example, I'm going to run a Traveler campaign, you might be like, well, I don't know anything about Traveler. I don't know the universe. It's all completely, it's all completely Greek to me, and the GM will spend his time explaining the Third Imperium, the rules on psychic warfare, how jump systems work, where if I said, we're going to run Star Trek, you're immediately going, maybe I'll play an Andorian security officer, because you already have a basis on what this is. You might, already start thinking in those terms. And, again, the GM's probably not going to spend as much time explaining how starships work or what the Federation is as much as he is going to maybe, nailing down the specifics. My campaign is set in the 23rd century. We're going to be basically, our ship left dock the same time as Enterprise NCC 1701D, or what have you. So that's really where the first thing is just, again, that difference in approach. And I think the first thing I would say is from a player's perspective and from a GM's perspective that the biggest thing you need to get right here is less the details and more the theme. And let me explain that. So oftentimes, one of the big hurdles and fears of running an RPG like this is the fact that you're going to, build the Star Trek story, and you're going to have that one guy in your group who knows Star Trek better than anyone, who will then, chide you with the fact that, you idiot, the Trill were never discovered at this point in history. How can he be a Trill? That's just stupid. And to be fair, the writers of these things, again, especially with something like Star Trek or Star Wars, where we've had, decades of product from different creatives, you're going to see differences. Also, think about the fact that in those cases, there are novels that are not canon. There is comic material that is not canon. There's all sorts of material that's official but not official or has been removed from canon. So it's pretty easy to get yourself confused as to what is and isn't canon. A good case in point of this, actually, in Star Trek, the episode where they introduced the idea of the Trills in TNG, they explained that they are such a new race that the Federation has no medical information on them whatsoever. They don't know what they are. They don't know anything about them. Their medical database is completely blank. So that when Ambassador Odan is shot and almost killed, and Crusher has to open him up on the table, she sees this giant slug, and he has to go, "No, Dr. Beverly, it's me." Then Deep Space Nine comes along a couple years later, not decades, not we forgot all about this, but a couple years later, and all of a sudden Dax as a character dated Dr. McCoy, had been instrumental in the Khitomer Accords, and was of course Sisko's superior officer. So this is a woman who pretty much, or series of beings who lived their lives a couple hundred years within Federation space, and yet the Federation knows so little about Trills that we have no medical information. I can't imagine that Curzon joined the Federation without taking a rudimentary physical. And again, that was an error that was made by professional creators, by professional writers who were being paid to write Star Trek material. So if you goof up something about a star date, who cares? It's pretty minor. And players, if the only joy you're really getting out of the game is to sit and gatekeep how much better you know Star Trek or Star Wars, then you're the one that's ruining people's fun, in all honesty. And to that end, if you think you can do a better job of storytelling, then you can try your hand at GMing, but that's the part of it is the storytelling and the game design aspects are a real big part of this, are a real big part of any RPG. Does it matter that I goofed up what subsector I'm using in Traveler, or that I'm telling a great story that players understand and enjoy? I had a very bad player in my group years ago who pulled this very same thing. He was upset at something that was happening in his campaign, and so he decided to take it out on my Star Wars game. One of the players was a smuggler, and he gave Admiral Akbar, they'd actually met him in a briefing. I brought him in. That was like the one cameo I decided to do. And basically, the smuggler gives him the equivalent of a Cuban cigar. Akbar nods and puts it in his pocket, and there's this player. The Timothy Zahn novels say that Admiral Akbar hates smugglers. First off, I had stated earlier in the campaign I'm not using the Zahn material because I hadn't read it. But he had to bring that up. 2, another player at the table then pointed out, no, he didn't like Han for giving up his military rank. And 3, as I then pointed out, this guy does not have smuggler tattooed on his damn forehead. And all we saw was Akbar give a very, curt, okay, thank you, He could have thrown the thing away afterwards and cursed the man's name. We don't know. But at the moment, he was being cordial. But this player was dead set on ruining the campaign that I was running because he wanted to prove that he knew more about Star Wars than the idiot running the game. And really, all he did was suck the fun out of the room for everyone. I've since run Star Wars and had no problems. It really is that kind of mentality that bothers me. Now, the opposite of the spectrum, though, because again, it's okay to question your GM, I think, about things, especially when they seem in place, out of place, or maybe there's something that or that's common knowledge that you think should be brought up. But again, just like in D&D, if you see a rule that's out of place, you handle it with respect. Hey, GM, I don't mean to be a jerk about this, but I think he gets a +2 modifier because we're actually, in this kind of situation. We're in a, I have him flanked, so doesn't he get a +2? And then the GM can go, yep, you're right, totally cool, or, no, because of some other factor that you might have missed. In fact, another case of the same point, a couple years after my Star Wars GMing debacle with that guy, I was at a convention running Marvel, and this 12-year-old kid, and I have to give this guy all full credit for this. The module was about cloning symbiotes, and this kid was playing Spider-Man. And so I told him, it's like, okay, make a check. Your spider sense goes off. You spin around, and there's venom coming down on you like a ton of bricks. The player played out the combat encounter and then asked, hey, can I talk to you in the other room for a second? Yeah, sure. So we walk in the other room. It's like, I don't want to ruin your campaign, sir, but just so that you're aware, venom has an ability that basically blots out Spider-Man's spider sense. And this was great to me because I just looked at him and smiled and said, you're absolutely right, he does. What does that tell you? And the look on that player's face was like, it's not really venom. Bingo! And again, that same I got something wrong as a GM went from one player insisting on sucking the life out of the room to another player, just verifying with me, and only to find out, yes, his knowledge of comics was awesome. It worked in his favor. And, he came back to the table all excited. I continued the scenario, and it ran out really well. So one thing is, I think, is don't panic about not knowing everything. And as a player, if you have a concern, just like any other concern in a game, talk to your GM. Let him know why you're concerned and if it's really a big deal. And again, if it's something like a call sign of a starship or, an address or something stupid, small, probably just let it go. And that's, again, as much on the players as it is on the GM. And, you're going to find that even, like I said, in a non-established RPG, you're going to have that one guy who insists on, using some arcane rule in some arcane way to screw up the game. This doesn't change that. The next thing I want to talk about here is really the how to set up the world. So one thing is, again, a lot of these games, a lot of these worlds are set up, especially with something like Star Wars or Star Trek, where you have all this continuity. And so my trick here is always the same, which is to set a point in the story's history, and then say, from here forward, this is my universe. This is the J-verse. We're going to go off on our own tangents, and we're going to do what we want. So, for example, let's say if I'm running a Star Wars campaign, and I set it, at the end of Rogue One. So at this point, we know that Vader's still large and in charge. We know that the rebel plans have been sent onto the Tentative 4, and he's probably going to get caught over Tatooine. And those events will run out as expected unless the players interfere. And what I mean by that is if, my characters run into a Luke Skywalker or a Ben Kenobi, now I'm not, particularly planning those things, but if it happens, then, they may influence the world. Maybe they point out they're a Jedi too and would love to come along, and therefore, now we have two Jedis. Which one is the final hope kind of thing. Or even, attacking or killing a character. What happens if, say, due to their actions, Chewbacca dies? Well, now we have to figure out this world without Chewbacca. Where does, his contributions make things different, if you will? Or even, what if they defeat Darth Vader? Now, in those cases, what I like to do is simply point out, yes, you have a shot. You want to attack Darth Vader? You want to attack Cthulhu? Go for it, man. You're welcome to it. Now, the thing is, I will drop the GM screen and we will run the numbers. We will run the full number set. I want you to understand what you're dealing with. I'm not going to make these characters clay pigeons for you to take out just for the fun of it, so you can brag. I totally took out Darth Vader in my Star Wars campaign. But I am going to let you try, and if and when you fail, that's going to be on you, and you're going to see those numbers up front. You're going to see, well, you add control dice into your lightsaber in D6 Star Wars. Vader has like a 17 control. That's 17 dice. That's coming down on your head now, dude. good luck with that. You know, it's pretty much a one-shot vapor kill. If you can avoid his saber and get in a bunch of shots, maybe you got him, but it's doubtful. So to that end, that's what I like to do, is simply state, okay, we're going to start from this point, you know, whatever point that is, you know, and then we're going to go our separate ways. You know, if those characters exist, you have the opportunity to run into them, but again, it's something also as a GM I don't tend to push for. I don't like, you know, if we're running a Star Trek campaign, I'm not going to have them run into Enterprise every chance they get, whichever generation. It's just, again, I want to forge my own world, but in the world that was set up, you know, and that's really what this is. It's using the toolkit of the world that they've set up to create your own stories. And so I think that's the other big thing, is just, you know, again, understanding, you know, picking a point, and then from there just, you know, making this your own, which is then no different from starting a game whole cloth, really. In conclusion, really, there's not much of a difference between games that were created by another previously created source and one that was cut whole cloth. In fact, if you look at it, a lot of these games were heavily inspired. I mean, Traveller has a lot of Isaac Asimov, a lot of Star Trek in it. Champions has a ton of Marvel and DC feels to it. And of course, even the granddaddy of all, Dungeons and Dragons, you know, feels a lot like somebody took crib notes from Lord of the Rings, Conan, and other fantasy sources. So, again, don't feel too worried about playing in an established universe. I would say ultimately what it comes down to is role-playing is all about telling a good story and the players and the GM having fun. And if you can do that, you know, whether the world that you're playing in was copyrighted by Disney, Fox, Paramount, what have you, or was, you know, a labor of love and, you know, that you wrote over the last 6 months, it really shouldn't matter, as long as, again, the players are having fun and you're enjoying what you're doing. Role-playing is not a competitive sport. It's certainly not one where accuracy is the most important part of the game. You know, it used to be that game systems were a lot more complex in trying to create something realistic, but now, as you see, most game systems kind of have gone away from that, because again, really you're about telling that story. And with that, all I can really say is, you know, I hope this has helped. If you have questions, concerns, comments, leave them in the description below. I love talking about this stuff and would love to hear from you. And in the meantime, I bid you adieu and happy gaming.